So Jordan, one of the things we've been working on is reading informational articles, right?
Yes.
Science, really, because you're doing these you're supposed to do one every day for your science class. And one of the things I'm finding out is that you are reading a whole lot better when you read articles on your level, right? You've been doing a lot better since you've been reading these articles that are so much more difficult, right? At first you weren't really liking them, right? But now, how are you feeling about reading these articles?
I'm feeling good because it's making my reading better and my clarification on reading better.
Okay.
And pulling out details.
Okay. So, what have you noticed about the vocabulary in these articles that we've come across?
That the vocabulary is very complex and they, like when I read them, I kind of don't have a clear understanding on what they mean.
Right. So, for instance, in this article, what vocabulary word did you need to know in order to really understand the central idea of this article?
Well, there's one,
Which
brood.
one? Oh, brood.
And there's another one.
Why was brood so important to know?
Because this, like I said before, they're very complex, the words, and they're not going to use like.
So what did the word brood mean in this article?
Well, based on the words before, like the title.
What part of the title? Ants, right? Brood meant ants. So it was important for you to know that the brood or this whole group was referring to ants in order to understand this article. What other word was important to understand?
Buoyancy.
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 What does that word mean? Do you remember?
Buoyancy means like the ability to float.
The ability to float.
On water.
On water. So read this whole sentence again and let's see why it was so important. While you're reading it, we're thinking about why was it so important for you to know the word buoyancy and brood. Read that sentence.
When facing a flood, ants build rafts and use both the buoyancy of the brood and the recovery ability of workers to minimize injury or death. According to a study published in PLOS One on February 19, 2014 by Jessica Purcell from University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and colleagues.
Okay, so stop right there, right? So I'll read that sentence again. It's a long sentence, isn't it? So when facing a flood, ants build rafts and use both the buoyancy of the brood and the recovery ability of workers to minimize injury or death, according to a study published in PLOS One on February 19, 2014 by Jessica Purcell from University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and colleagues. Right? So we were talking about why these two words, buoyancy and brood, were so important in understanding this sentence. So first of all, what was this sentence telling us?
This sentence was telling us, well, the most important part of the sentence was the beginning part where it says, when facing a flood, ants build rafts and use both the buoyancy of the brood and the recovery ability of workers to minimize injury or death.
So what does that mean?
That means that ants or broods have the ability to build rafts, and to get across in floods, and their raft has the recovery ability to minimize injury or death of the ants.
I like the way you said that. Their raft, right, you said the recovery ability, right? It's the recovery ability of workers to minimize injury or death to whom?
Injury or death of the ants.
Of the ants. Okay. Okay, pretty good. What was one of the other things? You had another misconception about this article when you read it the first time, right? And what was that? Do you remember?
Yes. When I was reading and I missed out a very important part of the text, which was sentence, half of the sentence, the part of the sentence that was important. Ants living on floodplains are known to link together to create rafts during floods.
Okay.
I misunderstood that because, I didn't misunderstand it, but I read past that and didn't really comprehend what it really meant.
You didn't think about it.
But now that I think about it, it means that the ants, because before they didn't tell you how the ants really made the raft, but they just told you that they have the ability to make it. But they make it, like right here, the part it says, as living on floodplains are known to, ants living on floodplains are known to link together to create rafts during floods. That means that the ants had the ability to build the raft and to stick their body together to create the raft during floods.
Right.
And if you read on, to still have the advantage to protect their queen.
Good. Okay. So, what other parts were confusing for you? Because I noticed you underlined some other words. What are some of the other words you underlined?
Well, all the words I underlined was rafts, biomes.
So let me ask you, why did you underline rafts here? Was it because you didn't know what a raft was?
Not specifically.
Right.
That's why, because
why did you underline it then?
I underlined it because I really didn't have a clear understanding of what raft was. I knew it was object that had the ability to float, but I underlined it because I didn't know the exact definition of it, so I wanted to know the definition.
Okay. I thought maybe you had underlined it because you thought it was really important, because it says when facing a flood, ants build rafts, and I was thinking when I saw that you underlined it that you wanted to make sure to remember that ants build rafts. That's what I was thinking, because I figured you knew what a raft was. Also, I was thinking that when facing a flood, ants build rafts, that you at this point were wondering to yourself, wow, ants build rafts. I wonder how. Is that what you were thinking when you read that line?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I'm thinking that once you read that, when facing a flood, ants build rafts, you started to think, how do they build rafts? So you weren't really connecting that to them. It's kind of almost hardly likely that you would think that they build the rafts using their own bodies, right? By linking together, right? So because of the way the writer writes it, right? The way this writer lays it out. He says ants build rafts. So you're thinking, well, I know ants, they carry stuff, food on their backs, right? So they probably build rafts. I would think the same thing. But here's the thing. I want you to, now that you know that the ants use their own bodies to build the rafts, I want you to think about this text and look at it and search closely and see that there's nowhere, see if you can find anywhere here that hints that the ants use anything other than their bodies to build the rafts.
Well,
do you see anything here that hints or suggests that the ants could be using anything other than their bodies to build the rafts? Because I just want you to see how tricky nonfiction reading can be.
Because it says,
Do you understand what I mean by use anything other than their bodies? Okay.
To better understand this process, scientists collected ants from a flood plain in Switzerland and brought them back to a lab so they could induce flooding in ant populations containing different combinations of worker ants, queens, and broods, containing developing larvae and pupae.
So what does that sentence tell you?
Well, it tells us right here that they can build a raft of different combinations, like worker ants, queens, and broods, which is ants, regular ants.
Oh, okay.
And they're containing larvae and pupae.
Right.
Or pupae.
Oh, I see what you're thinking. Oh, so you're thinking that larvae and pupae are something other than ants. Oh, okay. So you see this word developing, right? Containing. Have you ever seen these words before, larvae and pupae?
Not really.
Or larva and pupa? Oh, these are the plural. The singular for this will be larva, and the singular for this will be pupa. These are the different stages in development of ants. Right? So do you still think that ants build these rafts with anything other than ants? No. So what are you thinking larvae and pupae are?
They'll like what ants go through to growth, like to grow. Like us humans have different, I don't know the word.
Developmental stages.
Yeah, stages. We have different stages that we go through to grow up or be older.
Right.
And so it's like ants or any other insects.
Exactly. Right, exactly. So these words, again, you see how important it is to know, right? You didn't think of underlining these words, right? You kind of read over them. I thought you knew what they were because, flies, I believe, have the same vocabulary used when we talk about the development of flies, right? So I thought maybe you had known that. So now you see that, Jordan, here's the thing. Here's what you just learned, right? Once you've established the fact, because remember this is informational text, once you've established the facts that the ants are building these rafts out of their own bodies, right, linking them together, why would the writer then hint to the ants building these rafts using something else? You see what I mean? I don't know, maybe because he put that in parentheses, right? But remember, this is linked to what was said before. And what was said before is that these ant populations containing different combinations of worker ants, queens, and broods, containing developing larvae and pupae. Now here's one of the things I noticed. Remember I told you before, I noticed that whenever you read these science articles, you have a tendency to read over the experiments, remember? Because I noticed every time I look back at a science article that you read, you underlined important parts, but you always left out, you never underlined the experiment. Right? Remember? We noticed that was a pattern in your reading of these articles. And again, you didn't, that was part of the experiment, right? Right? And you didn't underline it. So maybe now when you read future articles that have an experiment, right? I want you to start paying closer attention to the experiment, because guess what? When you read the experiment, it forces you to think even harder, right? And remember, reading and writing are thinking activities. So when you read that experiment, it's going to force you to push your thinking to try and understand it, right? And that only makes you a better reader. You see? Because reading is all about stretching and stretching and stretching your thinking. You see what I'm saying? So from now on, we're not going to read over those experiments anymore. I want you to start underlining parts of the experiment that whoever is conducting the experiment, and I want you to start thinking about it. Slow down, right? In your reading, think about that experiment and make sure you really understand what the writer is saying. Okay? That's going to be your goal. Okay? You're going to set that SMART goal for the next article that you read. So let's just then wrap up and make sure that there are no more misconceptions, because that was a misconception. Even though you realized that it was the ants using their own bodies to make the rafts, but you still thought that somewhere in between they were using something else. But you learned that larvae and pupae are just the earlier stages of ant development, right? Okay. So during the flooding, read. Keep on reading.
During the flooding, they observed where the workers, broods, and queens were positioned in the raft. The flooding also allowed them to observe the buoyancy and recovery ability of the worker ants and brood.
Right. Okay. Keep going.
Researchers found that worker ants and brood were extremely resistant to submersion.
What does that mean?
Submersion.
I like the way you reread that to make sure because there was a period there.
I kind of like under the page. I kind of use my vocabulary thing. And I looked up submersion. Put or plunge under the surface of water.
Okay, good. So go back and see what that means. So researchers found
that the worker ants and brood were extremely resistant to submersion. Submersion.
So what does that mean?
Submersion means to put or plunge under the surface.
So what does
water.
the sentence mean now?
That resistant, like they were resistant, it was useless. The water was useless to them.
Okay.
So basically it's saying that researchers found that the worker ants and brood were extremely resistant to the plunge of the water.
Right. So picture that. What does that look like?
Like
what do you see happening?
They're riding on the flood, and when they're riding on the flood, if they plunge and the water comes on them, it's not going to do anything. They're just going to keep riding and riding.
Okay. So they're resistant to plunging under the water.
Because they know how to professionally link their bodies together.
And what other attribute do they have? In addition to being able to link themselves together, there's another attribute they have that's really important that you learned about.
That they...
There's another characteristic or feature about them that you learned about before, early on. So they link together well. They have that ability to link together, right? And they are resistant to submersion because why? What characteristic do they have that makes them resistant to submersion? Beautiful.
Buoyancy of the brood and the recovery ability.
Beautiful. I'm so proud of you, Jordan.
Minimize injury or death.
Beautiful. I'm so proud of you. And remember, we talked about synthesis before. Remember I told you, right? You cannot forget, you cannot afford to forget what you learned in the first paragraph when you're reading the second paragraph. Because the thing about writers, what writers do, they clarify. See, a writer will write something in that first paragraph. Further on, he still will write more sometimes to clarify what was said before or to link it, you see? So the writer is either clarifying or linking or giving more information, right? But the main thing that the reader has to do, the reader has to synthesize. The reader cannot afford to forget what happened up here. The reader has to remember to always be thinking about what was read before and accumulating it, right? Putting it all together. So you see now we can actually, what can we circle? We can circle this, resistant to submersion, and draw an arrow to
what makes them
right. Buoyancy, right? Buoyancy is the key, right? Yes. I like you did even more than I thought. I thought you were going to just draw the arrow to buoyancy, but you're right. You actually can draw that arrow to this entire sentence with a focus on buoyancy. Good work, Jordan. Good work. Alrighty, so let's finish up the workers.
The workers protected the most vulnerable and valuable nestmate, the queen, by placing her in the center of the raft, and the worker ants used the buoyancy of the brood at the base and recoverability of workers to create a raft and minimize ant injury. And this is, you can also draw an arrow to that too, because that also does.
Okay. So you circle that because?
Because it gives us another general idea, like up here.
Okay. Okay.
It repeats the sentence
Yes.
and the meaning.
Yes.
That's
he's
why
expanding.
that's why they put it down here.
Yes.
And up here.
Right. Expanding the meaning of what you read in the first paragraph. Absolutely. Keep going. Both workers.
Both workers and brood exhibited high survival rates. Survival rate after they rafted, which suggests that occupying the base of the raft is not as deadly as scientists expected. Placing the brood at the base of the raft may also aid in keeping the nest together during the flood. Dr. Purcell added, and Dr. Purcell is referring to Jessica Purcell, I think.
Yes. Wonderful.
Because her last name.
Yes.
And Dr. Purcell added, we expected the individual submerged on the base of the raft would face the highest cost, so we were astonished to see the ants systematically place the young colony members in that position. Further experiments revealed that the brood are the most buoyant members of the society, and that rafting does not decrease their survival. Thus, this configuration benefits the group of minimal cost.
So watch this now, Jordan. So I'm hoping that by now you learn some more about that word brood, right? Because now that we've read the whole article, we get a clearer picture of what the brood, specifically what the brood is referring to. What do you think about that word brood?
I know that if I read another article or like a story or any passage or a fiction passage, if I run
no, but I want you to think about this article. Okay, go ahead.
If I run across the word brood, I know what it means and I can relate to this passage.
Okay.
And if it's about ants, and then I can use, if I'm writing about it, I can use some information on here, but not too much, because I don't want to focus on this one.
Right.
The other one.
Right. So let's think about that word brood, because you're right. If you read another article and you see the word brood, you'll be able to figure it out. But now that we've read the whole thing, I'm looking at this, right? And first of all, when I was reading this part here, right? I was thinking to myself, we said that brood here means ants. And we're not wrong. We're not really wrong at all. But then when I read this part, it says, beginning. To better understand the process, scientists collected ants from a floodplain in Switzerland and brought them back to the lab so they could induce flooding in ant populations containing different combinations, listen to this, different combinations of worker ants, queens, and broods.
So they're basically saying that scientists like the different combinations, like from different, like I don't know what they.
Well, they're telling us
colonies,
right?
I think, right?
Well, combinations, yeah, it could be a mixture of colonies. But what are the listings of categories? Ants.
Well,
queens.
worker ants, because the worker ants.
Right, I'm sorry, you're right. Worker
build
ants.
the raft.
Right, you're right. I left out the word worker. It is worker ants, queens, and
brood.
broods. So what are broods then?
Because worker ants, they're regular ants, but they're like the ants that are protective of the queen.
Right.
And the ants, the broods, the regular broods, because I think the author used brood to make the regular ants. So worker ants are the ones that are protective and protect the queen, and the broods are the one who bring the food to the queen or bring food to their.
Oh, okay. I see what you're thinking, but here's what I'm thinking though. I'm thinking though that the broods are really, you see this in parentheses, containing developing larvae and pupae. the broods are like the babies. You see, because further down, look at down here. It says, we expected that individuals submerged on the base of the raft would face the highest cost, so we were astonished to see the ants systematically place the youngest colony members
In that position.
in that position. What's another word for the youngest colony members?
Brood.
Beautiful. Give me 5. That's what I'm talking about.
So they're ants, but they're just like baby ants.
Right.
And the worker
Yes.
ants are the adult ants.
Right. Got
So
it
if I
now?
was an ant, I would be a brood.
Possibly.
If you were an ant, you would be a worker ant.
Possibly. Right? So, further experiments revealed that the brood, keep on reading,
And the brood are the most buoyant members of the society, and that rafting does not decrease their survival. Thus, this configuration benefits the group of minimal cost.
So this configuration, meaning this organization of ants creating this raft, this configuration. A configuration is the way something is set up, right? So this setup, right setup under there, under configuration, right setup. Through an arrow, right setup. Okay, so this setup benefits the group at minimal cost, right? What does that mean at minimal cost?
At small cost.
Right.
Not a
Hardly any
big
that.
price like $15. Like
Right.
basically like $5.
But what's the cost we're talking about here in this money? Is the cost here money?
No, like the experiment. No.
What's the cost here? What will be the cost? But why does the writer use the word cost? At minimal cost to whom?
The ants.
The ants.
The-
meaning
yeah,
the
the-
meaning what?
That
What's the price that will be paid here in this flood?
well, if they weren't able to build a raft, they would all drown
Right.
or die.
Right. That will be the cost. That will be the price, right? The cost will be their lives. They'll be playing with their lives.
Basically, like price to pay it
Right.
if
the
they
price.
didn't know how.
Right, exactly. So now, why don't you circle brood?
Young ants.
Yeah. Right. So you see, Jordan, how a passage answers itself, right? So as you're having questions, you keep reading, right? The text answers itself, right? Now, I want to tell you why I knew something was wrong when I read this the first time. And I knew that I was misunderstanding brood, even though I knew I was right, that brood had to be ants. But once I saw ants, queen ants, and ants, that doesn't make sense, right? The writer wouldn't say ants, worker ants,
And then repeat.
queen, right, and then
And
broods,
say
right? So
ants.
right, so
And
this
he
has to
said
be a different
brood.
category.
And then he repetitively said brood throughout the thing. Throughout it. So he wanted. So if he wanted to just stick to the word brood, if brood was just ants, he would have just said worker broods.
Right, exactly.
So he just like, yeah, and then he said ants build. So if he wanted to stick to that, he would have said broods build.
Right,
And,
exactly.
And also, in the title it says ants. So,
Right. So you know that broods then is a different category of ants,
Yeah,
as
different-
opposed to
yeah.
worker ants, right?
Yeah.
So one thing you need to know, like small chickens, are also called broods.
Like any
Baby
kind of
chicks.
animal, like a young wolf would be
Right.
a brood.
Well,
yeah,
I don't know if it applies to wolves
well, small
particularly, but
insects
definitely
or-
chicken. Right? Yeah, chickens, the mother hen and her brood, right? Meaning her babies. All right. Good. So it's so important this for us to reread some of these articles, right? You did good. Yeah. You work very well in front of the camera.